Close your eyes, breathe deep, and prepare to be carried away by Robert E. Howard's chilling classic, Wings in the Night. You clicked for a truly unique sleep experience, and that's exactly what you'll get. We've combined Howard's masterful storytelling with red light visuals and narration specifically designed to lull you into the deepest, most peaceful sleep. But what ancient winged horrors will you encounter before dreams take hold? We'll delve into the forgotten corners of primeval forests, where something far older than mankind stirs. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let this journey begin. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment about your favorite part, and subscribe for more sleep-inducing tales. Wings in the Night. Chapter 1. The Horror on the Stake. Solomon Kane leaned on his strangely carved staff, gazing in scowling perplexity at the mystery before him. He had seen many deserted villages in the months since he turned east from the Slave Coast and lost himself in the jungle. But never one like this. No famine had driven the inhabitants away. Wild rice still grew rank in the untilled fields. There were no Arab slave raiders in this nameless land. It must have been a tribal war, Kane decided, observing the scattered bones and grinning skulls that littered the space among the weeds. These bones were shattered and splintered, and Kane saw jackals and a hyena slinking among the ruined huts. But why had the victors left the spoils? War spears lay crumbling, shields mouldered in the rain and sun, and cooking pots lay abandoned. A necklace of gaudily painted pebbles and shells, rare loot for any conqueror, still glistened about the neck bones of a shattered skeleton. He gazed at the huts, wondering why so many thatch roofs were torn and rented, as if by Talon things. Then something made his cold eyes narrow in startled disbelief. Just outside the crumbling village wall, a gigantic baobab tree towered, branchless for 60 feet. Its mighty trunk was too large to be gripped and scaled. Yet, in its topmost branches, a skeleton dangled, impaled on a broken limb. The cold hand of mystery touched Solomon Kane's shoulder. How did those pitiful remains come to be in that tree? Had some monstrous ogre's inhuman hand flung them there? Kane shrugged his broad shoulders, his hand unconsciously touching the black butts of his heavy pistols, the hilt of his long rapier, and the dirk in his belt. He felt no fear as an ordinary man would feel, confronted with the unknown and nameless. Years of wandering and warring with strange creatures had melted away all that was not steel and whalebone from his brain, soul, and body. He was tall and spare, almost gaunt, built with the savage economy of a wolf. Broad-shouldered, long-armed, with nerves of ice and sinews of spring steel, he was a natural killer and a born swordsman. The jungle's brambles and thorns had dealt harshly with him. His garments hung in tatters, his featherless slouch hat was torn, and his cordovan leather boots were scratched and worn. The sun had baked his chest and limbs to a deep bronze, but his ascetically lean face was impervious to its rays. His complexion retained that strange dark pallor which gave him an almost corpse-like appearance, belied only by his cold, light eyes. Sweeping the village once more with his searching gaze, Kane pulled his belt into a more comfortable position. He shifted the cat-headed stave Nlonga had given him to his left hand and resumed his journey. To the west lay a strip of thin forest, sloping downward to a broad belt of waist-deep savannas, a waving sea of grass. Beyond that rose another narrow strip of woodlands, rapidly deepening into dense jungle. Out of that jungle, Kane had fled like a hunted wolf, with pointed-toothed men hot on his trail. Even now, a vagrant breeze faintly carried the throb of a savage drum, whispering its obscene tale of hate, blood-hunger, and belly-lust across miles of jungle and grassland. The memory of his flight and narrow escape was vivid in Kane's mind. Only the day before had he realized too late that he was in cannibal country. All that afternoon, in the reeking stench of the thick jungle, he had crept, run, hidden, doubled, and twisted on his track with fierce hunters ever close behind him. Night fell, and he gained and crossed the grasslands under cover of darkness. Now, in the late morning, he had seen nothing and heard nothing of his pursuers. Yet, he had no reason to believe they had abandoned the chase. They had been close on his heels when he took to the savannas. So Cain surveyed the land before him. To the east, a straggling range of hills curved from north to south, mostly dry and barren. In the south, they rose to a jagged black skyline that reminded Cain of the Black Hills of Negri. Between him and these hills stretched a broad expanse of gently rolling, thickly treed country, though nowhere as dense as a jungle. Cain got the impression of a vast upland plateau, bounded by the curving hills to the east and the savannas to the west. Cain set out for the hills with his long, swinging, tireless stride. Surely somewhere behind him, the black demons were stealing after him, and he had no desire to be driven to the bay. A shot might send them flying in sudden terror, but on the other hand, so low they were in the scale of humanity, it might transmit no supernatural fear to their dull brains. Not even Solomon Kane, whom Sir Francis Drake had called Devon's King of Swords, could win a pitched battle with an entire tribe. The silent village, with its burden of death and mystery, faded behind him. Utter silence reigned among these mysterious uplands, where no bird sang, and only a silent macaw flitted among the great trees. The only sounds were Cain's cat-like tread and the whisper of the drum-haunted breeze. Then, Cain caught a glimpse among the trees that made his heart leap with sudden, nameless horror. Moments later, he stood before horror itself, stark and grisly. In a wide clearing, on a rather bold incline, stood a grim stake. Bound to it was a thing that had once been a black man. Cain had rowed, chained to the bench of a Turkish galley, and toiled in Barbary vineyards. He had battled Red Indians in the New Lands and languished in the dungeons of Spain's Inquisition. He knew much of man's fiendish inhumanity, but now he shuddered and grew sick. Yet, it was not so much the ghastliness of the mutilations, horrible as they were, that shook Cain's soul. It was the knowledge that the wretch still lived. As he drew near, the gory head that lolled on the butchered breast lifted and tossed from side to side, spattering blood from the stumps of ears. A bestial, rattling whimper drooled from the shredded lips. Cain spoke to the ghastly thing, and it screamed unbearably, writhing in incredible contortions. Its head jerked up and down with the jerking of mangled nerves, and the empty, gaping eye sockets seemed striving to see from their emptiness. Moaning low and brain-shatteringly, it huddled its outraged self against the stake where it was bound. It lifted its head in a grisly attitude of listening, as if expecting something from the skies. "Listen," said Cain, in the dialect of the river tribes. "Do not fear me. I will not harm you, and nothing else shall harm you any more. I am going to lose you." Even as he spoke, Cain was bitterly aware of the emptiness of his words. But his voice had filtered dimly into the crumbling, agony-shot brain of the man before him. From between splintered teeth fell words, faltering and uncertain, mingled with the slavering droolings of imbecility. He spoke a language akin to the dialects Cain had learned from friendly river folk on his wanderings. Cain gathered that he had been bound to the stake for a long time. Many moons, he whimpered in the delirium of approaching death. All this time, inhuman evil things had worked their monstrous will upon him. These things he mentioned by name, but Cain could make nothing of it, for he used an unfamiliar term that sounded like a kana. But these things had not bound him to the stake. The torn wretch slavered the name of Goru, who was a priest and who had drawn a cord too tight about his legs. Cain wondered that the memory of this small pain should linger through the red mazes of agony, that the dying man should whimper over it. And to Cain's horror, the black man spoke of his brother who had aided in binding him, and he wept with infantile sobs. Moisture formed in the empty sockets and made tears of blood. He muttered of a spear broken long ago in some dim hunt. While he muttered in his delirium, Cain gently cut his bonds and eased his broken body to the grass. But even at the Englishman's careful touch, the poor wretch writhed and howled like a dying dog, while blood started anew from a score of ghastly gashes, which, Cain noted, were more like wounds made by fong and talon than by knife or spear. At last it was done. The bloody, torn thing lay on the soft grass with Cain's old slouch hat beneath its death's head, breathing in great rattling gasps. Cain poured water from his canteen between the mangled lips. Bending close, he said, "Tell me more of these devils, for by the God of my people, this deed shall not go unavenged, though Satan himself bar my way." It is doubtful if the dying man heard, but he heard something else. A macaw, with the curiosity of its breed, swept from a nearby grove and passed so close its great wings fanned Cain's hair. At the sound of those wings, the butchered black man heaved upright and screamed in a voice that haunted Cain's dreams to the day of his death. "The wings! The wings! They come again! Ah, mercy, the wings!" And blood burst in a torrent from his lips, and so he died. Cain rose and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. The upland forest shimmered in the noonday heat. Silence lay over the land like an enchantment of dreams. Cain's brooding eyes ranged to the black, malevolent hills crouching in the distance and back to the faraway savannas. An ancient curse lay over that mysterious land, and its shadow fell across the soul of Solomon Cain. Tenderly, he lifted the red ruin that had once pulsed with life, youth, and vitality. He carried it to the edge of the glade. Arranging the cold limbs as best he might, and shuddering once again at the unnameable mutilations, he piled stones above it until even a prowling jackal would find it hard to get at the flesh below. He had scarcely finished when something jerked him back out of his somber broodings to a realization of his own position. A slight sound, or his own wolf-like instinct, made him whirl. On the other side of the glade, he caught a movement among the tall grasses, a glimpse of a hideous black face with an ivory ring in the flat nose. Thick lips parted to reveal filed teeth, apparent even at that distance. Beady eyes and a low, slanting forehead topped by a mop of frizzy hair. Even as the face faded from view, Cain leaped back into the shelter of the ring of trees that circled the glade. He ran like a deerhound, flitting from tree to tree, expecting at each moment to hear the exultant clamor of the warriors and to see them break cover at his back. But soon he decided that they were content to hunt him down as certain beasts track their prey, slowly and inevitably. He hastened through the upland forest, taking advantage of every bit of cover. He saw no more of his pursuers, yet he knew, as a hunted wolf knows, that they hovered close behind him, waiting their moment to strike him down without risk to their own hides. Cain smiled bleakly and without mirth. If it was to be a test of endurance, he would see how savage sinews compared with his own spring-steel resilience. Let night come, and he might yet give them the slip. If not, Cain knew in his heart that the savage essence of his very being, which chafed at his flight, would soon make him turn at bay, though his pursuers outnumbered him 100-1. The sun sank westward. Cain was hungry, for he had not eaten since early morning when he wolfed down the last of his dried meat. An occasional spring had given him water, and once he thought he glimpsed the roof of a large hut far away through the trees. But he gave it a wide berth. It was hard to believe that this silent plateau was inhabited, but if it were, The natives were doubtless as ferocious as those hunting him. Ahead of him, the land grew rougher, with broken boulders and steep slopes as he neared the lower reaches of the brooding hills. Still no sight of his hunters, except for faint glimpses caught by wary backward glances. A drifting shadow, the bending of the grass, the sudden straightening of a trodden twig, a rustle of leaves. Why should they be so cautious? Why did they not close in and have it over? Night fell, and Cain reached the first long slopes that led upward to the foot of the hills, which now brooded black and menacing above him. They were his goal, where he hoped to shake off his persistent foes at last. Yet a nameless aversion warned him away from them. They were pregnant with hidden evil, repellent as the coil of a great sleeping serpent glimpsed in the tall grass. Darkness fell heavily. The stars winked redly in the thick heat of the tropic night. Cain, halting for a moment in an unusually dense grove, beyond which the trees thinned out on the slopes, heard a stealthy movement that was not the night wind, for no breath of air stirred the heavy leaves. Even as he turned, there was a rush in the dark, under the trees. A shadow that merged with the shadows flung itself on Cain with a bestial mouthing and a rattle of iron. The Englishman, parrying by the gleam of the stars on the weapon, felt his assailant duck into close quarters and meet him chest to chest. Lean, wiry arms locked about him. Pointed teeth gnashed at him as Cain returned the fierce grapple. His tattered shirt ripped beneath a jagged edge, and by blind chance, Cain found and pinioned the hand that held the iron knife. He drew his own dirk, flesh crawling in anticipation of a spear in the back. But even as the Englishman wondered why the others did not come to their comrade's aid, he threw all his iron muscles into the single combat. Close clinched, they swayed and writhed in the darkness, each striving to drive his blade into the other's flesh. As the Puritan's superior strength began to assert itself, the cannibal howled like a rabid dog, tearing and biting. A convulsive spin-wheel of effort pivoted them out into the starlit glade, where Cain saw the ivory nose ring and the pointed teeth that snapped beast-like at his throat. Simultaneously, he forced back and down the hand that gripped his knife wrist, and drove the dirk deep into the black ribs. The warrior screamed, and the raw, acrid scent of blood flooded the night air. In that instant, Cain was stunned by a sudden savage rush and beat of mighty wings that dashed him to earth. The black man was torn from his grip and vanished with a scream of mortal agony. Cain leaped to his feet, shaken to his foundation. The dwindling scream of the wretched black man sounded faintly and from above him. Straining his eyes into the skies, he thought he caught a glimpse of a shapeless and horrific thing crossing the dim stars. In it, the writhing limbs of a human mingled namelessly with great wings and a shadowy shape. But so quickly it was gone, he could not be sure. Now he wondered if it were not all a nightmare. But groping in the grove, he found the juju stave with which he had parried the short stabbing spear that lay beside it. And here, if more proof was needed, was his long dirk, still stained with blood. Wings. Wings in the night. The skeleton in the village of torn roofs. The mutilated black man whose wounds were not made with a knife or spear, and who died shrieking of wings. Surely those hills were the haunt of gigantic birds who made humanity their prey. Yet if birds, why had they not wholly devoured the black man on the stake? And Cain knew in his heart that no true bird ever cast such a shadow as he had seen flit across the stars. He shrugged his shoulders, bewildered. The night was silent. Where were the rest of the cannibals who had followed him from their distant jungle? Had the fate of their comrade frightened them into flight? Cain looked at his pistols. Cannibals or no, he would not go up into those dark hills that night. Now he must sleep, if all the devils of the elder world were on his track. A deep roaring to the westward warned him that beasts of prey were aroam. He walked rapidly down the rolling slopes until he came to a dense grove some distance from the one in which he had fought the cannibal. He climbed high among the great branches until he found a thick crotch that would accommodate even his tall frame. The branches above would guard him from a sudden swoop of any winged thing, and if savages were lurking near, their clamber into the tree would warn him, for he slept lightly as a cat. As for serpents and leopards, they were chances he had taken 1,000 times. Solomon Kane slept, and his dreams were vague, chaotic, haunted with a suggestion of pre-human evil. At last, they merged into a vision as vivid as a scene in waking life. Solomon dreamed he woke with a start, drawing a pistol. So long had his life been that of the wolf, that reaching for a weapon was his natural reaction upon waking suddenly. His dream was that a strange, shadowy thing had perched upon a great branch close by and gazed at him with greedy, luminous yellow eyes that seared into his brain. The dream thing was tall and lean and strangely misshapen, so blended with the shadows that it seemed a shadow itself, tangible only in the narrow yellow eyes. Kane dreamed he waited, spellbound, while uncertainty came into those eyes. Then the creature walked out on the limb as a man would walk, raised great shadowy wings, sprang into space, and vanished. Kane jerked upright, the mists of sleep fading. In the dim starlight, under the arching Gothic-like branches, the tree was empty save for himself. Then it had been a dream, after all. Yet it had been so vivid, so fraught with inhuman foulness. Even now, a faint scent like that exuded by birds of prey seemed to linger in the air. Kane strained his ears. He heard the sighing of the night wind, the whisper of the leaves, the faraway roaring of a lion, but naught else. Again, Solomon slept, while high above him, a shadow wheeled against the stars, circling again and again as a vulture circles a dying wolf. Chapter 2. The Battle in the Sky. Dawn spread whitely over the eastern hills when Kane woke. His nightmare came to mind, and he again wondered at its vividness as he climbed down from the tree. A nearby spring slaked his thirst, and some fruit, rare in these highlands, eased his hunger. Then he turned his face once more to the hills. Solomon Kane was a determined fighter. Along that grim skyline, some evil foe to the sons of men resided. This fact alone challenged the Puritan as much as any glove thrown in his face by a hot-headed Devon gallant. Refreshed by his night's sleep, he set out with his long, easy stride, passing the grove that had witnessed the battle in the night. He entered the region where the trees thinned at the foot of the slopes. Up these slopes he went, halting for a moment to gaze back over the way he had come. Now, above the plateau, he could easily make out a village in the distance, a cluster of mud and bamboo huts with one unusually large hut a short distance from the rest on a low knoll. As he gazed, with a sudden rush of grisly wings, the terror was upon him. Kane whirled, galvanized. All signs had pointed to a winged creature that hunted by night. He had not expected an attack in broad daylight. But now, a bat-like monster swooped at him from the very eye of the rising sun. Kane saw a spread of mighty wings, from which glared a horribly human face. He drew and fired with unerring aim. The monster veered wildly in midair, whirling and tumbling out of the sky to crash at his feet. Kane leaned forward, pistol smoking in his hand, and gazed wide-eyed. Surely this thing was a demon from the black pits of hell, thought the somber Puritan, yet a leaden ball had slain it. Kane shrugged, baffled. He had never seen anything like it, though his life had led him through many strange paths. The creature resembled a man, inhumanly tall and thin. Its head was long, narrow, and hairless, the head of a predatory creature. The ears were small, close-set, and strangely pointed. Its eyes, fixed in death, were narrow, oblique, and of a strange yellowish color. The nose was thin and hooked, like the beak of a bird of prey. The mouth was a wide, cruel gash, whose thin lips, writhed in a death snarl and flecked with foam, disclosed wolfish fangs. The creature, which was naked and hairless, was not unlike a human being in other ways. The shoulders were broad and powerful, the neck long and lean. The arms were long and muscular, the thumbs set beside the fingers like those of a great ape. Fingers and thumbs were armed with heavy hooked talons. The chest was curiously misshapen, the breastbone jutting out like the keel of a ship, the ribs curving back from it. The legs were long and wiry, with huge hand-like prehensile feet, the great toe set opposite the rest like a man's thumb. The claws on the toes were merely long nails. But the most curious feature of this creature was on its back. A pair of great wings, shaped much like the wings of a moth but with a bony frame and leathery substance, grew from its shoulders. They began just behind and above where the arms joined the shoulders and extended halfway to the narrow hips. These wings, Kane reckoned, would measure some 18 feet from tip to tip. He laid hold of the creature, involuntarily shuddering at the slick, hard, leather-like feel of the skin, and half lifted it. Its weight was little more than half that of a man of the same height, some 6.5 feet. Evidently, the bones were of a peculiar bird-like structure, and the flesh consisted almost entirely of stringy muscles. Kane stepped back, surveying the thing again. Then his dream had been no dream after all. That foul thing, or another like it, had in grisly reality alighted in the tree beside him. A whir of mighty wings. A sudden rush through the sky. Even as Kane whirled, he realized he had committed the jungle-farer's unpardonable crime. He had allowed his astonishment and curiosity to throw him off guard. Already, a winged fiend was at his throat, and there was no time to draw and fire his other pistol. Kane saw, in a maze of thrashing wings, a devilish, semi-human face. He felt those wings battering at him. He felt cruel talons sink deep into his breast. Then he was dragged off his feet and felt empty space beneath him. The winged man had wrapped his limbs about the Englishman's legs, and the talons he had driven into Kane's breast muscles held like fanged vices. Wolf-like fangs drove at Kane's throat, but the Puritan gripped the bony throat and thrust back the grisly head. With his right hand, he strove to draw his dirk. The birdman was mounting slowly, and a fleeting glance showed Kane that they were already high above the trees. The Englishman did not hope to survive this battle in the sky, for even if he slew his foe, he would be dashed to death in the fall. But with the innate ferocity of the fighting man, he set himself grimly to take his captor with him. Holding those keen fangs at bay, Kane managed to draw his dirk and plunged it deep into the monster's body. The Batman veered wildly, and a rasping, raucous screech burst from his half-throttled throat. He floundered wildly, beating frantically with his great wings, bowing his back and twisting his head fiercely in a vain effort to free it and sink home his deadly fangs. He sank the talons of one hand agonizingly deeper into Kane's breast muscles, while with the other he tore at his foe's head and body. But the Englishman, gashed and bleeding, with the silent and tenacious savagery of a bulldog, sank his fingers deeper into the lean neck and drove his dirk home again and again. Far below, awed eyes watched the fiendish battle raging at that dizzy height. They had drifted out over the plateau, and the fast weakening wings of the Batman barely supported their weight. They were sinking swiftly earthward, but Kane, blinded with blood and battle fury, knew nothing of this. With a great piece of his scalp hanging loose, his chest and shoulders cut and ripped, The world had become a blind red thing in which he was aware of but one sensation, the bulldog's urge to kill his foe. Now the feeble and spasmodic beating of the dying monster's wings held them hovering for an instant above a thick grove of gigantic trees. Cain felt the grip of claws and twining limbs grow weaker, and the slashing of the talons became a futile flailing. With a last burst of power, he drove the reddened dirk straight through the breastbone and felt a convulsive tremor run through the creature's frame. The great wings fell limp, and victor and vanquished dropped headlong and plummet-like earthward. Through a red wave, Cain saw the waving branches rushing up to meet them. He felt them flail his face and tear at his clothing, as still locked in that death clinch, he rushed downward through leaves that eluded his vainly grasping hand. Then his head crashed against a great limb, and an endless abyss of blackness engulfed him. Chapter 3. The People in the Shadow. Through colossal, black basaltic corridors of night, Solomon Kane fled for 1,000 years. Gigantic winged demons, horrific in the utter darkness, swept over him with a rush of great bat-like pinions. In the blackness he fought with them as a cornered rat fought a vampire bat, while fleshless jaws drooled fearful blasphemies and horrid secrets in his ears, and the skulls of men rolled under his groping feet. Solomon Kane returned suddenly from the land of delirium. His first sight of sanity was a fat, kindly native face bending over him. Kane saw he was in a roomy, clean, and well-ventilated hut. From a cooking pot bubbling outside wafted savory scents. Kane realized he was ravenously hungry and strangely weak. The hand he lifted to his bandaged head shook, and its bronze was dimmed. The fat man and another, a tall, gaunt, grim-faced warrior, bent over him. The fat man said, "He is awake, Kuroba, and of sound mind." The gaunt man nodded and called something, which was answered from without. "What is this place?" asked Kane in a language he had learned, similar to the dialect the black man had used. "How long have I been here?" "This is the last village of Baganda." The fat man gently pressed him back. "We found you lying beneath the trees on the slopes, badly wounded and senseless. You have raved in delirium for many days. Now eat." A lithe young warrior entered with a wooden bowl full of steaming food, and Kane ate ravenously. "He is like a leopard, Kuroba," said the fat man admiringly. "Not 1 in 1,000 would have lived with his wounds." "Aye," returned the other. "And he slew the Akana that rented him, Goru." Kane struggled to his elbows. "Goru," he cried fiercely. "The priest who binds men to stakes for devils to eat?" He strove to rise, intending to strangle the fat man, but weakness swept over him like a wave. The hut swam dizzily to his eyes, and he sank back panting, where he soon fell into a sound, natural sleep. Later, he awoke and found a slim young girl named Nayila watching him. She fed him, and feeling much stronger, Kane asked questions which she answered shyly but intelligently. This was Baganda, ruled by Kuroba the chief and Goru the priest. None in Baganda had ever seen or heard of a white man before. She counted the days Kane had lain helpless, and he was amazed. But such a battle as he had been through was enough to kill an ordinary man. He wondered that no bones had been broken, but the girl said the branches had broken his fall, and he had landed on the body of the Akana. He asked for Goru, and the fat priest came to him, bringing Kane's weapons. "Some we found with you where you lay," said Goru. "Some by the body of the Akana you slew with the weapon which speaks in fire and smoke. You must be a god, yet the gods bleed not, and you have just all but died. Who are you?" "I am no god," Kane answered, "but a man like yourself. I come from a far land amid the sea, which land, mind ye, is the fairest and noblest of all lands. My name is Solomon Kane, and I am a landless wanderer. From the lips of a dying man I first heard your name. Yet your face seemeth kindly. A shadow crossed the shaman's eyes, and he hung his head. Rest and grow strong, O man or god or whatever you be, he said, and in time you will learn of the ancient curse that rests upon this ancient land. In the days that followed, while Cain recovered and grew strong with his wild beast vitality, Goru and Koroba sat and spoke to him at length, telling him many curious things. Their tribe was not aboriginal here, but had come upon the plateau 150 years before, giving it the name of their former home. They had once been a powerful tribe in Old Baganda, on a great river far to the south. But tribal wars broke their power, and at last, before a concerted uprising, the whole tribe gave way. Goru repeated legends of that great flight of 1,000 miles through jungle and swampland, harried at every step by cruel foes. At last, hacking their way through a country of ferocious cannibals, they found themselves safe from man's attack, but prisoners in a trap from which neither they nor their descendants could ever escape. They were in the horror country of Akana, and Goru said his ancestors came to understand the jeering laughter of the man-eaters who had hounded them to the very borders of the plateau. The Bagandi found a fertile country with good water and plenty of game. There were numbers of goats and a species of wild pig that thrived here in great abundance. At first, the black people ate these pigs, but later they spared them for a good reason. The grasslands between plateau and jungle swarmed with antelopes, buffaloes, and the like, and there were many lions. Lions also roamed the plateau, but Baganda meant lion slayer in their tongue, and it was not many moons before the remnants of the great cats took to the lower levels. But it was not lions they had to fear, as Goru's ancestors soon learned. Finding that the cannibals would not come past the savannas, they rested from their long trek and built 2 villages, Upper and Lower Baganda. Cain was in Upper Baganda. He had seen the ruins of the lower village. But soon they found that they had strayed into a country of nightmares with dripping fangs and talons. They heard the beat of mighty wings at night and saw horrific shadows cross the stars and loom against the moon. Children began to disappear, and at last, a young hunter strayed off into the hills, where night overtook him. In the gray light of dawn, a mangled, half-devoured corpse fell from the skies into the village street, and a whisper of ogreish laughter from high above froze the horrified onlookers. Then, a little later, the full horror of their position burst upon the Bagandi. At first, the winged men were afraid of the black people. They hid themselves and ventured from their caverns only at night. Then they grew bolder. In the full daylight, a warrior shot one with an arrow, but the fiends had learned they could slay a human. Its death scream brought a score of the devils dropping from the skies, who tore the slayer to pieces in full sight of the tribe. The Bagandi then prepared to leave that devil's country. 100 warriors went up into the hills to find a pass. They found steep walls, up which a man must climb laboriously, and they found the cliffs honeycombed with caves where the winged men dwelt. Then was fought the first pitched battle between men and batmen, and it resulted in a crushing victory for the monsters. The bows and spears of the black people proved futile before the swoops of the taloned fiends. Of all that 100 that went up into the hills, not one survived. For the Akanas hunted down those that fled and dragged down the last one within bowshot of the upper village. Then it was that the Bagandi, seeing they could not hope to win through the hills, sought to fight their way out again the way they had come. But a great horde of cannibals met them in the grasslands, and in a great battle that lasted nearly all day, hurled them back, broken and defeated. Goru said that while the battle raged, the skies were thronged with hideous shapes, circling above and laughing their fearful mirth to see men die wholesale. So the survivors of those 2 battles, licking their wounds, bowed to the inevitable with the fatalistic philosophy of the black man. Some 1,500 men, women, and children remained, and they built their huts, tilled the soil, and lived stolidly in the shadow of the nightmare. In those days, there were many of the bird people, and they might have wiped out the Bagandi utterly had they wished. No one warrior could cope with an Akana, for he was stronger than a human. He struck as a hawk strikes, and if he missed, his wings carried him out of reach of a counterblow. Here, Cain interrupted to ask why the Bagandi did not make war on the demons with arrows. But Guru answered that it took a quick and accurate archer to strike an Akana in midair at all, and so tough were their hides that unless the arrow struck squarely it would not penetrate. Cain knew that the natives were very indifferent bowmen and that they pointed their shafts with chipped stone, bone, or hammered iron almost as soft as copper. He thought of Poitiers and Agincourt and wished grimly for a file of stout English archers, or a rank of musketeers. But Guru said the Akanas did not seem to wish to destroy the Bagandi utterly. Their chief food consisted of the little pigs which then swarmed the plateau, and young goats. Sometimes they went out on the savannas for antelope, but they distrusted the open country and feared the lions. Nor did they haunt the jungles beyond, for the trees grew too close for the spread of their wings. They kept to the hills and the plateau, and what lay beyond those hills none in Baganda knew. The Akanas allowed the Bagandi to inhabit the plateau much as men allow wild animals to thrive, or stock lakes with fish, for their own pleasure. The Bat people, said Guru, had a strange and grisly sense of humor which was tickled by the sufferings of a howling human. Those grim hills had echoed to cries that turned men's hearts to ice. But for many years, Guru said, once the Bagandi learned not to resist their masters, the Akanas were content to snatch up a baby from time to time, or devour a young girl strayed from the village, or a youth whose night caught outside the walls. The Bat folk distrusted the village. They circled high above it but did not venture within. There, the Bagandi were safe until late years. Guru said that the Akanas were fast dying out. Once there had been hope that the remnants of his race would outlast them. In which event, he said fatalistically, the cannibals would undoubtedly come up from the jungle and put the survivors in their cooking pots. Now he doubted if there were more than 150 Akanas altogether. Cain asked him why the warriors then did not sally forth on a great hunt and destroy the devils utterly. Guru smiled a bitter smile and repeated his remarks about the prowess of the Bat people in battle. Moreover, he said, the whole tribe of Baganda numbered only about 400 souls now, and the Bat people were their only protection against the cannibals to the west. Guru said the tribe had thinned more in the past 30 years than in all the years previous. As the numbers of the Akanas dwindled, their hellish savagery increased. They seized more and more of the Bagandi to torture and devour in their grim black caves high up in the hills. Guru spoke of sudden raids on hunting parties and toilers in the plantain fields, and of the nights made ghastly by horrible screams and gibberings from the dark hills, and blood-freezing laughter that was half-human, of dismembered limbs and gory grinning heads flung from the skies to fall in the shuddering village, and of grisly feasts among the stars. Then came drought, Guru said, and a great famine. Many of the springs dried up, and the crops of rice and yams and plantains failed. The gnus, deer, and buffaloes, which had formed the main part of Baganda's meat diet, withdrew to the jungle in quest of water. The lions, their hunger overcoming their fear of man, ranged into the uplands. Many of the tribe died, and the rest were driven by hunger to eat the pigs which were the natural prey of the Bat people. This angered the Akanas and thinned the pigs. Famine, Bagandi, and the lions destroyed all the goats and half the pigs. At last, the famine was over, but the damage was done. Of all the great droves that once swarmed the plateau, only a remnant was left, and these were hard to catch. The Bagandi had eaten the pigs, so the Akanas ate the Bagandi. Life became a hell for the black people. The lower village, numbering now only some 150 souls, rose in revolt. Driven to frenzy by repeated outrages, they turned on their masters. An Akana lighting in the very streets to steal a child was set on and shot to death with arrows. The people of Lower Baganda drew into their huts and waited for their doom. And in the night, said Guru, it came. The Akanas had overcome their distrust of the huts. The full flock of them swarmed down from the hills, and Upper Baganda awoke to hear the fearful cataclysm of screams and blasphemies that marked the end of the other village. All night Gora's people had lain sweating in terror, not daring to move, hearkening to the howling and gibbering that rent the night. At last these sounds ceased, Guru said, wiping the cold sweat from his brow, but sounds of grisly and obscene feasting still haunted the night with demons' mockery. In the early dawn, Gora's people saw the hell flock winging back to their hills, like demons flying back to hell through the dawn. They flew slowly and heavily, like gorged vultures. Later, the people dared to steal down to the accursed village, and what they found there sent them shrieking away. To that day, Guru said, no man passed within 3 bow shots of that silent horror. Cain nodded in understanding, his cold eyes more somber than ever. For many days after that, Guru said the people waited in quaking fear. Finally, in desperation, a fear which breeds unspeakable cruelty, the tribe cast lots. The loser was bound to a stake between the 2 villages, in hopes that the Akanas would recognize this as a token of submission, so that the people of Baganda might escape the fate of their kinsmen. The custom, said Guru, had been borrowed from the cannibals who in old times worshipped the Akanas and offered a human sacrifice at each moon. But chance had shown them that the Akanas could be killed, so they ceased to worship them. At least that was Gora's deduction, and he explained at much length that no mortal thing is worthy of real adoration, however evil or powerful it may be. His own ancestors had made occasional sacrifices to placate the winged devils, but until lately it had not been a regular custom. Now it was necessary. The Akanas expected it, and each moon they chose from their waning numbers a strong young man or a girl whom they bound to the stake. Cain watched Goru's face closely as he spoke of his sorrow for this unspeakable necessity, and the Englishman realized that the priest was sincere. Cain shuddered at the thought of a tribe of human beings thus passing slowly but surely into the maws of a race of monsters. Cain spoke of the wretch he had seen, and Guru nodded, pain in his soft eyes. For a day and a night he had been hanging there, while the Akanas glutted their vile torture lust on his quivering, agonized flesh. Thus far the sacrifices had kept doom from the village. The remaining pigs furnished sustenance for the dwindling Akanas, together with an occasional baby snatched up, and they were content to have their nameless sport with a single victim each moon. A thought came to Cain. The cannibals never come up into the plateau? Guru shook his head. Safe in their jungle, they never raided past the savannas. But they hunted me to the very foot of the hills. Again Guru shook his head. There was only one cannibal. They had found his footprints. Evidently, a single warrior, bolder than the rest, had allowed his passion for the chase to overcome his fear of the grisly plateau and had paid the penalty. Cain's teeth came together with a vicious snap which ordinarily took the place of profanity with him. He was stung by the thought of fleeing so long from a single enemy. No wonder that enemy had followed so cautiously, waiting until dark to attack. But, asked Cain, why had the Akana seized the black man instead of himself? And why had he not been attacked by the Batman who alighted in his tree that night? The cannibal was bleeding, Guru answered. The scent called the bat fiend to attack, for they scented raw blood as far as vultures. And they were very wary. They had never seen a man like Cain, who showed no fear. Surely they had decided to spy on him, take him off guard before they struck. Who were these creatures? Cain asked. Guru shrugged his shoulders. They were there when his ancestors came, who had never heard of them before they saw them. There was no intercourse with the cannibals, so they could learn nothing from them. The Akanas lived in caves, naked like beasts. They knew nothing of fire and ate only fresh, raw meat. But they had a language of a sort and acknowledged a king among them. Many died in the great famine when the stronger ate the weaker. They were vanishing swiftly. Of late years no females or young had been observed among them. When these males died at last, there would be no more Akanas. But Baganda, observed Guru, was doomed already, unless he looked strangely and wistfully at Cain. But the Puritan was deep in thought. Among the swarm of native legends he had heard on his wanderings, one now stood out. Long, long ago, an old juju man had told him, winged devils came flying out of the north and passed over his country, vanishing in the maze of the jungle-haunted south. And the juju man related an old legend concerning these creatures, that once they had abode in myriad numbers far on a great lake of bitter water many moons to the north, and ages ago a chieftain and his warriors fought them with bows and arrows and slew many, driving the rest into the south. The name of the chief was Nyasana, and he owned a great war canoe with many oars driving it swiftly through the bitter water. And now a cold wind blew suddenly on Solomon Kane, as if from a door opened suddenly on outer gulfs of time and space. For now he realized the truth of that garbled myth, and the truth of an older, grimmer legend. For what was the great bitter lake but the Mediterranean Ocean, and who was the chief Nyasana but the hero Jason, who conquered the Harpies and drove them, not alone into the Strophades Isles but into Africa as well? The old pagan tale was true then, Cain thought dizzily, shrinking aghast from the strange realm of grisly possibilities this opened up. For if this myth of the Harpies were a reality, what of the other legends? The Hydra, the Centaurs, the Chimera, Medusa, Pan, and the Satyrs? All those myths of antiquity. Behind them did there lie and lurk nightmare realities with slavering fangs and talons steeped in shuddersome evil? Africa, the dark continent, land of shadows and horror, of bewitchment and sorcery, into which all evil things had been banished before the growing light of the Western world. Cain came out of his reveries with a start. Guru was tugging gently and timidly at his sleeve. "Save us from the Akanas," said Guru. "If you are not a god, there is the power of a god in you. You bear in your hand the mighty juju stave which has in times gone by been the scepter of fallen empires and the staff of mighty priests. And you have weapons which speak death in fire and smoke. For our young men watched and saw you slay 2 Akanas. We will make you king, god, what you will. More than a moon has passed since you came into Baganda, and the time for the sacrifice is gone by, but the bloody stake stands bare. The Akanas shun the village where you live. They steal no more babies from us. We have thrown off their yoke because our trust is in you." Cain clasped his temples with his hands. "You know not what you ask," he cried. "God knoweth it is in my deepest heart to rid the land of this evil, but I am no god. With my pistols I can slay a few of the fiends, but I have but a little powder left. Had I a great store of powder and ball, and the musket I shattered in the vampire-haunted hills of the dead, then indeed would there be a rare hunting. But even if I slew all those fiends, what of the cannibals?" "They too will fear you," cried old Karoba, while the girl Nayila and the lad Loga, who was to have been the next sacrifice, gazed at his wife, their souls in their eyes. Cain dropped his chin on his fist and sighed. "Yet will I stay here in Baganda all the rest of my life if ye think I am protecting the people." So Solomon Cain stayed at the village of Baganda of the Shadow. The people were a kind folk, whose natural sprightliness and fun-loving spirits were subdued and saddened by long dwelling in the shadow. But now they had taken new heart by the Englishman's coming, and it wrenched Cain's heart to note the pathetic trust they placed in him. Now they sang in the plantain fields and danced about the fire, and gazed at him with adoring faith in their eyes. But Cain, cursing his own helplessness, knew how futile his fancied protection if the winged fiends swept suddenly out of the skies. But he stayed in Baganda. In his dreams, the gulls wheeled above the cliffs of old Devon, carved in the clean blue wind-whipped skies, and in the day the call of the unknown lands beyond Baganda clawed at his heart with fierce yearning. But he stayed in Baganda and racked his brains for a plan. He sat and gazed for hours at the juju stave, hoping in desperation that black magic would aid him, where his mind failed. But Nlongare's ancient gift gave him no aid. Once he had summoned the Slave Coast shaman to him across leagues of intervening space, but it was only when confronted with supernatural manifestations that Nlonga could come to him, and these harpies were not supernatural. The germ of an idea began to grow at the back of Cain's mind, but he discarded it. It had to do with a great trap, and how could the Akanas be trapped? The roaring of lions played a grim accompaniment to his brooding meditations. As man dwindled on the plateau, the hunting beasts who feared only the spears of the hunters were beginning to gather. Cain laughed bitterly. It was not lions, that might be hunted down and slain singly, that he had to deal with. At some distance from the village stood the great hut of Goru, once a council hall. This hut was full of many strange fetishes which, Goru said with a helpless wave of his fat hands, were strong magic against evil spirits but scant protection against winged hellions of gristle and bone and flesh. Chapter 4. The Madness of Solomon. Cain woke suddenly from a dreamless sleep. A hideous medley of screams burst horrific in his ears. Outside his hut, people were dying in the night, horribly, like cattle in a slaughterhouse. He had slept, as always, with his weapons buckled on. Now he bounded to the door, and something fell, mouthing and slavering at his feet, to grasp his knees in a convulsive grin and gibber incoherent pleas. In the faint light of a nearby smoldering fire, Cain recognized the face of the youth, Loga. It was frightfully torn and drenched in blood, already freezing into a death mask. The night was full of fearful sounds, inhuman howling mingled with the whisper of mighty wings, the tearing of thatch, and ghastly demon laughter. Cain freed himself from the locked, dead arms and sprang to the dying fire. He could make out only a confused, vague maze of fleeing forms and darting shapes, the shift and blur of dark wings against the stars. He snatched up a brand and thrust it against the thatch of his hut. As the flame leaped up and showed him the scene, he stood frozen and aghast. Red, howling doom had fallen on Baganda. Winged monsters raced screaming through her streets, wheeled above the heads of the fleeing people, or tore apart the hut thatches to get at the gibbering victims within. With a choked cry, the Englishman woke from his trance of horror. He drew and fired at a darting, flame-eyed shadow which fell at his feet with a shattered skull. Cain let out a deep, fierce roar and bounded into the melee. All the berserk fury of his heathen Saxon ancestors burst into terrible beings. Dazed and bewildered by the sudden attack, and cowed by long years of submission, the Bagandi were incapable of combined resistance. For the most part, they died like sheep. Some, maddened by desperation, fought back, but their arrows went wild or glanced from the tough wings. The devilish agility of the creatures made spear thrusts and axe strokes uncertain. Leaping from the ground, they avoided the blows of their victims and, sweeping down upon their shoulders, dashed them to earth where Fong and Talon did their crimson work. Cain saw old Kuroba, gaunt and blood-stained, at bay against a hut wall, his foot on the neck of a monster who had not been quick enough. The grim-faced old chief wielded a two-handed axe in great sweeping blows that for the moment held back the screeching onset of half a dozen of the devils. Cain was leaping to his aid when a low, pitiful whimper checked him. The girl Nayila writhed weakly, prone in the bloody dust, while on her back a vulture-like thing crouched and tore. Her dulling eyes sought the face of the Englishman in anguished appeal. Cain ripped out a bitter oath and fired point blank. The winged devil pitched backward with an abhorrent screeching and a wild flutter of dying wings, and Cain bent to the dying girl. She whimpered and kissed his hands with uncertain lips as he cradled her head in his arms. Her eyes set. Cain laid the body gently down, then looked for Kuroba. He saw only a huddled cluster of grisly shapes that sucked and tore at something between them. And Cain went mad. With a scream that cut through the inferno, he bounded up, slaying even as he rose. Even in the act of lunging up from a bent knee, he drew and thrust, transfixing a vulture-like throat. Then, whipping out his rapier as the thing floundered and twitched in its death struggle, the raging Puritan charged forward, seeking new victims. On all sides of him, the people of Baganda were dying hideously. They fought futilely or they fled, and the demons coursed them down as a hawk courses a hare. They ran into the huts, and the fiends rented the thatch or burst the door. What took place in those huts was mercifully hidden from Cain's eyes. To the frantic Puritan's horror-distorted brain, it seemed that he alone was responsible. The black folk had trusted him to save them. They had withheld the sacrifice and defied their grim masters. Now they were paying the horrible penalty, and he was unable to save them. In the agony-dimmed eyes turned toward him, Cain quaffed the black dregs of the bitter cup. It was hot anger, or the vindictiveness of fear. It was hurt, and a stunned reproach. He was their god, and he had failed them. Now he ravened through the massacre, and the fiends avoided him, turning to easier victims. But Cain was not to be denied. In a red haze that was not of the burning hut, he saw a culminating horror. A harpy gripped a writhing, naked thing that had been a woman, and its wolfish fangs gorged deep. As Cain sprang, thrusting, the Batman dropped his yammering, mewing prey and soared aloft. But Cain dropped his rapier and, with the bound of a blood-mad panther, caught the demon's throat and locked his iron legs about its lower body. Once again, he found himself battling in mid-air, but this time close above the hut roofs. Terror had entered the cold brain of the harpy. He did not fight to hold and slay. He wished only to be rid of this silent, clinging thing that stabbed so savagely for his life. He floundered wildly, screaming abhorrently and thrashing with his wings. Then, as Cain's dirk bit deeper, it dipped suddenly sidewise and fell headlong. The thatch of a hut broke their fall, and Cain and the dying harpy crashed through to land on a writhing mass on the hut floor. In the lurid flickering of the burning hut outside, which vaguely lit the hut into which he had fallen, Cain saw a deed of brain-shaking horror being enacted, red dripping fangs in a yawning gash of a mouth, and a crimson travesty of a human form that still writhed with agonized life. Then, in the maze of madness that held him, his steel fingers closed on the fiend's throat in a grip that no tearing of talons or hammering of wings could loosen, until he felt the horrid life flow out from under his fingers and the bony neck hung broken. Outside, the red madness of slaughter continued. Cain bounded up, his hand closing blindly on the haft of some weapon. As he leaped from the hut, a harpy soared from under his very feet. It was an axe that Cain had snatched up, and he dealt a stroke that spattered the demon's brains like water. He sprang forward, stumbling over bodies and parts of bodies, blood streaming from a dozen wounds, and then halted, baffled and screaming with rage. The Bat People were taking to the air. No longer would they face this strange madman, who in his insanity was more terrible than they. But they went not alone into the upper regions. In their lustful talons, they bore writhing, screaming forms. Cain, raging to and fro with his dripping axe, found himself alone in a corpse-choked village. He threw back his head to shriek his hate at the fiends above him, and he felt warm, thick drops fall into his face, while the shadowy skies were filled with screams of agony and the laughter of monsters. As the sounds of that ghastly feast in the skies filled the night, and the blood that rained from the stars fell into his face, Cain's last vestige of reason snapped. He gibbered to and fro, screaming chaotic blasphemies. And was he not a symbol of man, staggering among the tooth-marked bones and severed grinning heads of humans, brandishing a futile axe, and screaming incoherent hate at the grisly, winged shapes of night that make him their prey, chuckling in demoniac triumph above him and dripping into his mad eyes the pitiful blood of their human victims? Chapter 5. The Conqueror. A shuddering, white-faced dawn crept over the black hills. It shivered above the red shambles that had been the village of Baganda. The hut stood intact, except for the one which had sunk to smoldering coals, but the thatches of many were torn. Dismembered bones, half or wholly stripped of flesh, lay in the streets. Some were splintered as though they had been dropped from a great height. It was a realm of the dead where only one sign of life remained. Solomon Cain leaned on his blood-clotted axe, gazing upon the scene with dull, mad eyes. He was grimed and clotted with half-dried blood from long gashes on his chest, face, and shoulders. But he paid no heed to his hurts. The people of Baganda had not died alone. 17 harpies lay among the bones. Cain had slain 6 of these. The rest had fallen before the frantic, dying desperation of the black people. But it was a poor toll to take in return. Of the 400-odd people of Upper Baganda, not one had lived to see the dawn. And the harpies were gone, back to their caves in the Black Hills, gorged to repletion. With slow, mechanical steps, Cain went about gathering up his weapons. He found his sword, dirk, pistols, and the juju stave. He left the main village and went up the slope to the great hut of Guru. And there he halted, stung by a new horror. The ghastly humor of the harpies had prompted a delicious jest. Above the hut door stared at the severed head of Guru. The fat cheeks were shrunken, the lips lolled in an aspect of horrified idiocy, and the eyes stared like a hurt child. And in those dead eyes, Cain saw wonder and reproach. Cain looked at the shambles that had been Baganda, and he looked at the death mask of Guru. He lifted his clenched fists above his head, and with glaring raised eyes and writhing lips flecked with froth, he cursed the sky and the earth and the spheres above and below. He cursed the cold stars, the blazing sun, the mocking moon, and the whisper of the wind. He cursed all fates and destinies, all that he had loved or hated, the silent cities beneath the seas, the past ages and the future eons. In one soul-shaking burst of blasphemy, he cursed the gods and devils who make mankind their sport, and he cursed man who lives blindly on and blindly offers his back to the iron-hoofed feet of his gods. Then, as breath failed, he halted, panting. From the lower reaches sounded the deep roaring of a lion, and into the eyes of Solomon Cain came a crafty gleam. He stood long, as one frozen, and out of his madness grew a desperate plan. And he silently recanted his blasphemy, for if the brazen-hoofed gods made man for their sport and plaything, they also gave him a brain that holds craft and cruelty greater than any other living thing. "There you shall die," said Solomon Cain to the head of Guru. "The sun will wither you, and the cold dew of night will shrivel you. But I will keep the kites from you, and your eyes shall see the fall of your slayers. I could not save the people of Baganda, but by the God of my race, I can avenge them." Man is the sport and sustenance of titanic beings of night and horror, whose giant wings hover ever above him. But even evil things may come to an end, and watch ye, Goru. In the days that followed, Cain labored mightily, beginning with the first gray light of dawn and toiling on past sunset, into the white moonlight, until he fell and slept in utter exhaustion. He snatched food as he worked, and he gave his wounds absolutely no heed, scarcely being aware that they healed of themselves. He went down into the lower levels and cut bamboo, great stacks of long, tough stalks. He cut thick branches of trees, and tough vines to serve as ropes. With this material, he reinforced the walls and roof of Gora's hut. He set the bamboos deep in the earth, hard against the wall, and interwove and twined them, binding them fast with the vines that were pliant and tough as cords. The long branches he made fast along the thatch, binding them close together. When he had finished, an elephant could scarcely have burst through the walls. The lions had come into the plateau in great numbers, and the herds of little pigs dwindled fast. Those the lions spared, Cain slew and tossed to the jackals. This racked Cain's heart, for he was a kindly man, and this wholesale slaughter, even of pigs who would fall prey to hunting beasts anyhow, grieved him. But it was part of his plan of vengeance, and he steeled his heart. The days stretched into weeks. Cain toiled day and by night, and between his stints he talked to the shriveled, mummified head of Goru, whose eyes, strangely enough, did not change in the blaze of the sun or the haunt of the moon, but retained their lifelike expression. When the memory of those lunacy-haunted days had become only a vague nightmare, Cain wondered if, as it had seemed to him, Gora's dried lips had moved in answer, speaking strange and mysterious things. Cain saw the Akanas wheeling against the sky at a distance, but they did not come near, even when he slept in the great hut, pistols at hand. They feared his power to deal death with smoke and thunder. At first, he noted that they flew sluggishly, gorged with the flesh they had eaten on that red night, and the bodies they had borne to their caves. But as the weeks passed, they appeared leaner and ranged far afield in search of food. And Cain laughed, deeply and madly. This plan of his would never have worked before, but now there were no humans to fill the bellies of the harpy folk, and there were no more pigs. In all the plateau, there were no creatures for the bat people to eat. Why they did not range east of the hills, Cain thought he knew. That must be a region of thick jungle like the country to the west. He saw them fly into the grassland for antelopes, and he saw the lions take their toll on them. After all, the Akanas were weak beings among the hunters, strong enough only to slay pigs and deer, and humans. At last, they began to soar close to him at night, and he saw their greedy eyes glaring at him through the gloom. He judged the time was ripe. Huge buffaloes, too big and ferocious for the bat people to slay, had strayed up into the plateau to ravage the deserted fields of the dead black people. Cain cut one of these out of the herd and drove him, with shouts and volleys of stones, to the hut of Goru. It was a tedious, dangerous task, and time and again, Cain barely escaped the surly bull's sudden charges, but persevered and at last shot the beast before the hut. A strong west wind was blowing, and Cain flung handfuls of blood into the air for the scent to waft to the harpies in the hills. He cut the bull to pieces and carried its quarters into the hut, then managed to drag the huge trunk itself inside. Then he retired into the thick trees nearby and waited. He had not long to wait. The morning air filled suddenly with a beat of many wings, and a hideous flock alighted before the hut of Goru. All of the beasts or men seemed to be there, and Cain gazed in wonder at the tall, strange creatures, so like to humanity and yet so unlike, the veritable demons of priestly legend. They folded their wings like cloaks about them as they walked upright, and they talked to one another in a strident, crackling voice that had nothing of the human in it. No, Cain decided, these things were not men. They were the materialization of some ghastly jest of nature, some travesty of the world's infancy when creation was an experiment. Perhaps they were the offspring of a forbidden and obscene mating of man and beast. More likely they were a freakish offshoot on the branch of evolution, for Cain had long ago dimly sensed a truth in the heretical theories of the ancient philosophers that man is but a higher beast. And if nature made many strange beasts in the past ages, why should she not have experimented with monstrous forms of mankind? Surely man, as Cain knew him, was not the first of his breed to walk the earth, nor yet to be the last. Now the harpies hesitated, with their natural distrust for a building, and some soared to the roof and tore at the thatch. But Cain had built well. They returned to earth, and at last, driven beyond endurance by the smell of raw blood and the sight of the flesh within, one of them ventured inside. In an instant, all were crowded into the great hut, tearing ravenously at the meat. When the last one was within, Cain reached out a hand and jerked a long vine which tripped the catch that held the door he had built. It fell with a crash, and the bar he had fashioned dropped into place. That door would hold against the charge of a wild bull. Cain came from his cover and scanned the sky. Some 140 harpies had entered the hut. He saw no more winging through the skies and believed it safe to suppose he had the whole flock trapped. Then, with a cruel, brooding smile, Cain struck flint and steel to a pile of dead leaves next to the wall. Within sounded an uneasy mumbling as the creatures realized that they were prisoners. A thin wisp of smoke curled upward, and a flicker of red followed it. The whole heap burst into flame, and the dry bamboo caught. A few moments later, the whole side of the wall was ablaze. The fiends inside scented the smoke and grew restless. Cain heard them cackling wildly and clawing at the walls. He grinned savagely, bleakly, and without mirth. Now a veer of the wind drove the flames around the wall and up over the thatch. With a roar the whole hut caught and leaped into flame. From within sounded a fearful pandemonium. Cain heard bodies crash against the walls, which shook to the impact but held. The horrid screams were music to his soul, and brandishing his arms, he answered them with screams of fearful, soul-shaking laughter. The cataclysm of horror rose unbearably, paling the tumult of the flames. Then it dwindled to a medley of strangled gibbering and gasps as the flames ate in and the smoke thickened. An intolerable scent of burning flesh pervaded the atmosphere, and had there been room in Cain's brain for a thought other than insane triumph, he would have shuddered to realize that the scent was of that nauseating and indescribable odor that only human flesh emits when burning. From the thick cloud of smoke, Cain saw a mewing, gibbering thing emerge through the shredding roof and flap slowly and agonizingly upward on fearfully burned wings. Calmly he aimed and fired, and the scorched and blinded thing tumbled back into the flaming mass just as the walls crashed in. To Cain it seemed that Goru's crumbling face, vanishing in the smoke, split suddenly in a wide grin, and a sudden shout of exultant human laughter mingled eerily in the roar of the flames. But the smoke and insane brain played queer tricks. Cain stood with the juju stave in one hand and the smoking pistol in the other, above the smoldering ruins that hid forever from the sight of man, the last of those terrible, semi-human monsters whom another hero had banished from Europe in an unknown age. Cain stood, an unconscious statue of triumph. The ancient empires fall, the dark-skinned peoples fade, and even the demons of antiquity gasp their last. But over all stands the Aryan barbarian, white-skinned, cold-eyed, dominant, the supreme fighting man of the earth, whether he be clad in wolf-hide and horned helmet, or boots and doublet, whether he bear in his hand battle-axe or rapier, whether he be called Dorian, Saxon, or Englishman, whether his name is Jason, Hengist, or Solomon Kane. Smoke curled upward into the morning sky, and the roaring of foraging lions shook the plateau. Slowly, like light breaking through mists, sanity returned to him. "The light of God's morning enters even into dark and lonesome lands," said Solomon Kane somberly. "Evil rules in the waste lands of the earth, but even evil may come to an end. Dawn follows midnight, and even in this lost land the shadows shrink. Strange are thy ways, O God of my people, and who am I to question thy wisdom? My feet have fallen in evil ways, but thou hast brought me forth scatheless and hast made me a scourge for the powers of evil. Over the souls of men spread the condor wings of colossal monsters, and all manner of evil things prey upon the heart and soul and body of man. Yet it may be in some far day the shadows shall fade and the prince of darkness be chained forever in his hell. Until then, mankind can but stand up stoutly to the monsters in his own heart and without, and with the aid of God, he may yet triumph." And Solomon Kane looked up into the silent hills and felt the silent call of the hills and the unguessed distances beyond. And Solomon Kane shifted his belt, took his staff firmly in his hand, and turned his face eastward.